Hello, hello. Recently, David Lynch passed away a couple of days ago. So this is a bit of an off-the-cuff art gripe that I threw together very quickly because, one, algorithm, of course, but also I've recently been thinking about the idea of doing a Twin Peaks specific video. And just by coincidence, this happened around the same time. So I got to thinking, why would I be making a Twin Peaks video in the first place? And that kind of compelled me to make this. Because when it comes to Lynch, that's sort of how I think about him as well. And I will explain. First, I'll give a little bit of my own background as far as watching his stuff goes. Now, David Lynch is kind of unusual in that even though he's most associated with being a movie director, he actually hasn't made that many feature films. I can actually list them off very, very quickly. He made Eraserhead, which was the film that kind of launched him. Then The Elephant Man. And then infamously he made the first Dune, which you may be scratching your head about. Yes, he made Dune. And then after that, which did not get a sequel, by the way, he did Blue Velvet and Wild at Heart, which I didn't think was particularly successful. And he followed that up with Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, which was a feature film that bridges between... It was something that happened right after Twin Peaks came out, so it kind of bridges everything that happens after that as far as its continuity is concerned. After that, Lost Highway, The Straight Story, Mulholland Drive, and finally Inland Empire. And that is it. That's all he ever did as far as actual movies were concerned. Now, as far as short films were concerned, he's way, way more prolific. And I'm definitely not going to list those because there's a huge amount of those, which I think is telling for him. He was also, of course, involved in several television projects, most famously, of course, Twin Peaks. Also, some oddball little web series like Rabbits. You may have seen or heard of that one before, like a little claymation sort of thing. Also, Weather Reports, which on his YouTube channel, he used to run a couple things that I sort of paid attention to sometimes. One was Weather Reports, where he literally just read the weather for where he lived. And the other was Today's Number Is, where he would just read what today's number is. Again, that was it. I'll get more on that in a bit, I guess. Also, he dipped into like commercials and music videos and things of that nature. He did a lot of work with other actors. He did some acting himself as well, of course, usually in his own things, though. And of course, documentary films, and also he did some voice acting. Famously, he did Gus the bartender in The Cleveland Show, and I think he also starred in Family Guy as a result as well. And he was also in Robot Chicken, I think, a couple of times as well. So, point being, even though he's famous for being a director, he didn't do that much movie directing. But he was extremely prolific, and he was just all over the place, doing all sorts of different things. And he was fairly well connected as well. Now, of course, the thing that I most associate with him is Twin Peaks. And whenever I was growing up, at the age of, I guess, I would have been around 10 or so, starting at 10, Twin Peaks was huge at the time. From the ages of like 10 to 13 or so. There was one year in particular that Twin Peaks was absolutely massive, and that's whenever it first came out. Now, I'm not going to go into the history of Twin Peaks or anything like that, but the gist of it is that Twin Peaks Season 1 was huge worldwide. Oddly enough, I think it also has a massive following in Japan, or it did at the time. And a lot of that was centered around the idea of what is going on in this series, and who killed Laura Palmer, famously, and just trying to piece things together as though it was a puzzle. And this was pre-internet, so there was no subreddit somewhere where people could gather and do this sort of thing. It was handled in very strange ways of people communicating over ham radio and sending videotapes to one another and doing things in their living room, like physically rewinding the tapes from the shows that they recorded the night before, just pausing frames and things like that. It was crazy. Twin Peaks was absolutely massive at the time. This era was kind of defined by these phases of culture being really attached to superstars or major properties. Like I think of Michael Jackson and The Simpsons specifically. It was just an era for that, where things were larger than life, and not only were they huge in America, they were huge all over the world, and Twin Peaks just so happened to be one of those things. Now, little baby me, at the ripe age of 12 or whatever I was, did not want to watch Twin Peaks, because why would I? That's not a cartoon. I want to watch cartoons. I'm the artist, after all. So that's what I was preoccupied with. It wasn't really until much later in life where I started going back to things that had come out whenever I was younger that I didn't bother with, that I picked up Twin Peaks and started looking at that, because Twin Peaks Season 3, which, came out about 25 or something years afterwards, I think it was about to come out, so I wanted to see what that was all about. And I have seen him, of course, star in things like Family Guy or Cleveland Show, and I've seen some of his web shorts, and one or two of his movies. So my personal relationship with the man's work is very limited. So I'm not making this for the sake of, he was a very important person to me, and I'm obsessed with him, and I'm going to give you all the information about him. I can't. But what I can give you is the perspective that I have as a creator and just a person. And I think in many ways, that's way more important when it comes to David Lynch, and I will explain. Now, as recent as this morning, a few minutes ago, getting off the phone, I was talking to my mother, and something that I was having a very small conversation with her, and I asked her if eating was a bother for her, because she was getting ready to eat some leftovers. And she said, no, it's one of the few things that I enjoy during the day. Like, I really look forward to doing that specifically. Because her lifestyle is basically, waking up, watching YouTube videos, doing some housework, that sort of thing. She's an older woman, so things have kind of just become a rut in that sense. This is something that can happen as we get older. So, of course, I have sort of an anxious attachment personality, which I've learned recently is a thing, which means that I'm really preoccupied with how other people are doing. And I find it very difficult to enjoy myself if I know that someone else might not feel good that's around me, that I care about. So, of course, naturally, I immediately got really preoccupied with this idea. How do people enjoy themselves through life? This is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Because a lot of emphasis is often placed on marriage, but I know some married people that, of course, that are just miserable. They're around someone, but they don't really talk to them, or there's not much depth to their marriage, or maybe there is, but something else is missing. It just depends on what level of importance that we're putting on different things, and whether we're getting that back from life or not. So giving my mother this example of, I know, married people and so on, and explaining what was going on in their lives. And her response was for her own marriage, which my father has passed by now. But she said that it's very natural for married couples to get together, they get really preoccupied with one another, and then they have children, and those children cause sort of a separation between them, where the woman gets really preoccupied with them, and the man might start gravitating towards other interests, and start getting preoccupied with something else. Like the case of my father, he got really caught up in college basketball, for example, which, whenever I was younger, I thought was just, this is something men do, right? I didn't really care that much myself, but, it's just something guys do. And as I've gotten older, I realized the reason why people get preoccupied and obsessed with things often is because they just have nothing else going on. Not that that's, an explanation for everyone and so on, but that's just something people do. We try to gravitate and find things to preoccupy ourselves with to help define ourselves and the world around us. Because, not to try to get too deep here, when it comes to the human condition, there is this sort of innate emptiness that we all have. And we're all trying to find something that will fill that hole, as it were. Now, to me, I feel like, I don't know the secret to life here, but for me, it feels like a lot of that comes down to our ability to find like-minded people that are very similar to us, or that, at least that we find a lot of value in, and being able to have shared experiences with those people and, just cohabitate with them. That's what we're wired to do. We're humans. We're not that complicated, really. We are evolved to just be, like gorillas or chimpanzees or so on, where we're effectively just animals that are meant to be roaming through the woods. We find food, we eat it, we hang out, and then we go to bed. And in the process, we, patrol our territory, we find new things. Wow, what a crazy thing that was today. Remember this? And that's it. That's the whole human life experience. And it's gotten way more complicated over time for obvious reasons, but that's still the core to how we behave. We want a core group of people that we are comfortable being around, that we enjoy being around, and whenever we see or experience new things, we can share them together. And in the process, we might find a mate that has very similar sort of experiences, but we might reach a part where we're sort of just cohabitating with them. And we might drift apart, we might stay together. You develop your own interests, you become complete people that just so happen to be cohabitating, and you share one another's responsibilities and so on. This is life. Like, this is the whole package. In some ways, it's absurdly complicated. And in others, it is not complicated at all. Now, David Lynch. David Lynch, for example, I know recently, I don't pay that much attention to the man. Like, I'm not, like some David Lynch, some people are absolutely crazy when it comes to David Lynch. They know way more than I will. If you want to know a lot about David Lynch, you can easily find lots of information about him, because he is fascinating in a lot of ways. So a lot of people have done a lot of research on the man, a lot of research on his life, and his work especially. So there are reams and reams of things that you can read about him. Now, I do know that recently he went through a divorce, and he wrote a song, which basically was, the summation of that song is basically, "Fuck you, bitch. I'm glad you're gone. I'm much happier now." That was, like, it was not exactly shocking. Like, I know enough about David Lynch to be like, oh, here he goes. But, that's what the song effectively was about. So even in his final years, he was going through this. I don't know how many people were around him, how many close friends he happened to have, but it does seem to me that he went through that same life experience of experiencing and creating things with people that he liked, getting married, drifting apart a bit. In his case, they eventually split up because they became two different people or whatever happened with them. He got the standard package just like the rest of us. Now, there are two main things that differentiate him from everyone else, I feel, that make him unique in some way. The most obvious is his work, and he's usually described as being a surrealist. If you've ever watched any of his films or anything really, even Twin Peaks is like this, then there are a lot of mysteries in his work, a lot of things that are just visually arresting, and you're supposed to watch them and not know what exactly it is that you're looking at, what's going on. But whenever you actually talk to Lynch, he's very adamant that things are self-evident, and that you don't need an explanation for them. You already know the answers. Now, I think he's full of crap, but I also know exactly what he means, because once I learned something about him, which is the other thing that I'm going to talk about, then everything sort of fell into place, which is why I'm going to sort of work backwards. Usually people will go over all the crazy things, and then they'll go over this thing, and, but to me, this makes more sense. All right, so David Lynch is and was obsessed with transcendental meditation. Now, this also has an incredibly deep dive that you can go down, but the gist of it is that there was one particular physicist, I think his name's John Hagelin or something like that, because I think he's also the president of the David Lynch Foundation himself. Anyways, he is a physicist that looked at the concept of the unified field theory, which Einstein, I think is Einstein, developed the idea of. Basically the idea that everything can be explained by a single unified field, which has sort of become grand unified theory instead. Okay, so if you're like me and you're at this point and you hear about, grand unified theory, or, like the theory of everything, which is the idea that you can basically write down a mathematical formula that explains everything in the entire universe, how things move, where they came from, and you can plug that in and basically solve anything. Like it's the mathematical holy grail. You would hear that and go, what? What? What does that have to do with David Lynch? Why would he? Okay. But the gist of it is, this guy is talking about, John, the physicist. He got really preoccupied with this idea that this was not just, unified theory in the sense of mathematics and so on, that it's somehow related to human consciousness. And at this point, it is, quackery, so, don't worry about that part of it. But David Lynch got really preoccupied with this. Back in, I think, like the 70s or something. So everything that he makes is related to this. So that's the reason why everything that he makes is really weird and surrealist, and why he also claims that everything makes sense. Because the way that David Lynch looks at this, and you can find a documentary of him sort of explaining this, is that he views consciousness as being this sort of surface level. And that as you dive deeper, you're like passing the complexity of molecules until you get to this sort of ocean of like basic, raw, unfiltered consciousness, like the origin point of everything in the universe, the unified field, effectively. And he's also viewing this in terms of how he thinks. And he has this belief that if he meditates, he gets rid of the complications associated with, human thought, and can dive deeper until he gets to this raw consciousness that's at the very, very bottom of all reality. And once he gets to there, all he has to do is like bring some of that stuff back up. So whenever he is making things, the reason why it seems so surrealist is often and the reason why it has these dreamlike qualities is because that's how he thinks creatively. I will give one example of this, and probably the best example. In Twin Peaks, there is a character known as Bob, which shows up fairly early. It's not like a spoiler or anything, I suppose. Bob, rather famously, was a stagehand that was on set. That was not even part of the plot whenever they got started. But whenever he was filming Twin Peaks, there's different variations of the story, but the gist of it is Lynch, I think, overheard someone say, "Be careful, Frank Silva." Frank is, still in there because he was like doing setup for the shooting, and he was like hiding behind the bed, and they didn't want him to accidentally get inside of the shot. And in that moment, either Lynch saw it in his head or he physically saw Frank doing this. But this imagery of him like concealing himself behind the bed, looking up at the camera, just immediately seized him. And as a result, he felt compelled to introduce him as a character in the series. Because the way that David Lynch thinks, it's almost sort of religious in the sense of, it's destiny. If I thought this in the moment and it seemed spiritual to me, if it seemed like something that just struck me, it's important. It came from somewhere. It came from the unified field, the most basic raw material that's down there somewhere. Some part of me in my conscious state drew that up, and now it's important. So obviously it needs to be here. And what I think is interesting about David is, even though this keeps happening with him over and over and over again in his work, it doesn't become a mess. Because if you actually watch Twin Peaks, there's, especially in Twin Peaks Season 1, it's very structured. You can see the through line of a story, and certainly weird things happen, and they most certainly do. But it's not so divorced from reality that you can't keep track of everything for the most part. There are lots of unanswered questions even today, but it's still structured. Like he still has an organized mind, which I find is very interesting. And in Twin Peaks Season 3, which happens 25 years later, is made for Showtime, I actually prefer Twin Peaks Season 3, maybe, certainly over 2. Season 2, there's a whole story, don't worry about it. But in many ways, I prefer Season 3. It's like dark and fun at the same time. It's very strange. And there are lots of visual and even auditory elements to the story that you really have to keep track of and focus on. And I'll explain it this way. This is the easiest way to explain it. I thought also about making a structured video, one that's actually scripted, in the future that is about the nature of art. Because this is something that people loved to debate whenever I was a kid. I don't know if it's still a thing or not. In one of my art classes, for my final, I had to write a paper on me defining what art was, which I got very upset with at the teacher because I was very, very adamant that the entire crux of the debate around what is art itself was meaningless, and she eventually accepted that. She really wanted, because she knew I understood what the purpose of it was. It wasn't to define what art was. It was the process that you're supposed to go through. And I made it clear to her, I get it. I want to ramble about this. So eventually she acquiesced and said, okay, just write what you're going to write. I'll grade it. But often people will see, abstract images or whatever, or, a banana that's taped to a wall, famously, things like that. And they'll get very angry at the concept of an artist, like, oh, fart-sniffing artists, like, it's all meaningless, it doesn't mean anything, it's pointless. And, believe me, I get that. But a lot of the times, not all the time, a lot of the time, the reason why you make things as an artist is not necessarily because you're trying to communicate a very specific literal message of, just gun rights are great, or, abortion's wrong, things like that, whatever it is. That's not the point. Often the point is that you're just trying to invoke thought in someone, or you're trying to communicate an emotion to something you're feeling. It depends wildly. It always depends so wildly, which is why it's so frustrating trying to talk about what the meaning behind a piece of art is. Because sometimes we will misinterpret a piece of art as meanings, there's an accepted interpretation of it. But whenever you go back and look at it historically, it meant something completely different to the person whenever they made it. Because we have taken that and appropriated it, and now it means something much more specific to modern people, depending on, just what we've grown up with and what we project onto it. And in my writing, in my videos and essays, I talk a lot about the nature of projection and how important that happens to be. Whenever you're making a video, it's way more important not to communicate your message, but to involve the viewer. It's way more important to involve the viewer. Because if the viewer is involved in projecting their ideas onto something, they are involved. It's way more specific and meaningful to them, because there's nothing for them to take and then disagree with. All they're doing is just taking raw information and then going, yes, this reminds me of something from my childhood, or this is something important to me. This probably means this. So being able to develop that as a skill as a writer is very important, but it's also very difficult, because you have to break yourself of just trying to regurgitate information very literally. And that is what I find so interesting about David Lynch, because he sort of, I guess you could argue intentionally, but to me sort of accidentally in a way, just happened upon this in a very expert way. There are moments in Twin Peaks Season 3 where the character that you're following, try not to spoil anything, where the character that you're following is very, very literally diving down through reality, past molecules and so on, and they reach the unified field. And whenever you see it, it makes no sense unless you know this specifically about David Lynch. But whenever you do know it, you see it and you go, yes, this is exactly what he's getting at. This character is at, the fount of all, rational thought and everything. That's what the point of this scene happens to be. And that's sort of the key that sort of unlocks everything else, and then everything starts falling into place. And that's what watching a lot of his films and specifically Twin Peaks Season 3 is like. You aren't literally just sitting there taking in raw information like you're watching an ordinary film. You're supposed to be processing this in terms of what sort of emotion it's making you feel and what the nature of the character happens to be. Like, it's supposed to be very abstract. The point is often not what the character is doing, it's what is motivating the character. It's the tonality of, is what the character doing correct or not? Because there are often times in Twin Peaks Season 3, whenever everything is culminating, that you really get the impression of, yes, the character has reached their goal, and this seems to be right to the viewer, but something is off. There's a tone to it, and you don't know what that is, and you don't know why it feels that way. And the process of you, the viewer, trying to process why it feels strange and why it feels wrong is exactly what David Lynch is going for. Because you're not supposed to just look at it and just go, okay, point A, B, C, D. This character is doing this character wanted this, he got it, etc. Just very literal information. That's not the point. David Lynch famously will not explain anything about anything that he makes. The fact that he is in this little documentary explaining what transcendental meditation is and how he, processes information, that's the closest you ever get to him really explaining anything about his creative process, or the meaning behind anything, or anything, really. And a lot of writers are like this, where they know if you answer a question about something, it's an answered question. And once you answer that question, a lot of the people that were projecting their meaning onto it lose that meaning, and as a result they lose the love that they had for it. It's like listening to a song, as I've said before, and you don't quite understand the lyrics. So as a result, those lyrics can become very, very personal to you. And once you actually go and read what the lyrics are supposed to be, that shatters that illusion. And now suddenly it's a song about something that's way more mundane, or about something that's way more specific, or something that you just don't care about. And as a result, a lot of that personalization that you had for that song is now lost. And in the creative process, David Lynch knew that was incredibly vital. So to him, the way that he thinks, this is important, the way that David Lynch thinks is there is a raw, definite truth that is below all of reality. And it's the same for everyone. So the point is not really knowing how things are, what is literal. The point is being able to reach down and keep going, achieve happiness, and to be able to discover the raw information that is accessible to all of us. And once you reach that point, then we're unified, we're happy. We don't need that information. It's not important. You realize, you realize all of the things that I was diving through, all of the answers that I was looking for, were completely pointless. Because what really mattered was reaching the bottom. I disagree with him, because I don't believe in this unified field stuff, but I understand him. And more specifically, I agree with the rationalization that often it is not about the literal information, it's about the sensation or the importance of projecting on to what you're seeing and so on. So in the process of watching anything that he makes, that is always what I'm thinking about. We watched Eraserhead in Discord, probably like a few months ago. It was the first time I had ever seen Eraserhead. And if you have not seen Eraserhead, I don't know if I can recommend watching it. I guess so. If you've never seen Eraserhead, you're going to watch it and go, what the hell am I looking at? Which is a very understandable reaction. Because it's not supposed to be taken in a very literal way. Now, I'm not going to do a review of Eraserhead here. I'm resisting the urge. You can actually hear it in my voice. I'm resisting very violently the urge to do it. The gist of it, though, seems to be that it is about a young man that is panicking about the idea of being a father. And the changes that will come to his life, the means by which he will achieve happiness, whether he can have happiness, the estrangement that he feels about the people around him, and so on. It's about those things, but they are not literally spelled out. They're all communicated through visuals, and some of those are very particular. Like in Twin Peaks, for example, there's a point where someone is talking about a Formica table, and like a tabletop, and you have to know also that Formica is used in creating like electrical lines. Like it moves energy. And if you don't know that, you lose part of the meaning behind it. So in evaluating things with Lynch, sometimes they are just raw information that is just evocative, and then other times he is utilizing things that, if you know more about whatever's behind it, then suddenly things will start clicking and it'll make way more sense, which can be something that's very frustrating when watching anything that's Lynchian, because there is a definite through line to how he thinks and processes information that he will not tell you, and the characters will not tell you. And that's the reason why people are so obsessed with communally coming together and trying to evaluate what they're watching and sharing things that they may not know with one another, which is a fun process, but it's also very frustrating. So something else I wanted to point out, in Twin Peaks Season 1 specifically, the character of Coop is obsessed with cherry pie and coffee. And the point of that seems to be that he is juxtapositioning the very sweet with the bitter. And those things are important to have. And it's something David Lynch talked about a lot as well, mainly in the 90s, but he continued to do so, even to today, is the idea that life is composed of those two things. It's the sweet and the bitter. And it's important to be able to have the dark and the light, because if you don't have, this is a very common thought in a lot of people's writing, if you don't have the dark, then you can't know how important it is to have the light. They're two very important elements to everyday life. I don't necessarily agree with that in the sense of I've never seen it as being a binary of you need one part light, one part dark. To me, happiness comes down to a lot of minor interests and a lot of building things up and just creating lots of different sources of small amounts of dopamine hits and things like that. Things that you don't necessarily, you can't marry yourself to any one thing in the sense of it being a source of happiness. That's the danger. If you're obsessed with one particular game, or you're obsessed with one particular IP, or one particular person, if you lose that thing, then you lose everything, effectively. Life is about being able to cultivate and grow sources of happiness around you. And a lot of that comes down to having the right people in your life, the right interests in your life, having the right financial stability, and just, it's an ever-changing process of just cultivating this forest that our ancient primate ancestors lived in, where we're just trying to hang on, but at the same time making sure that everything is at peace around us. However, it is moments of darkness that help define how important those things are. Often, we do not appreciate things until they're gone. Often, we have things in our life that we don't realize are incredibly important until something very dramatic happens that scares us into realizing I need to hold on to these things. It's a very common experience. So it's not as though light and dark are divided 1-to-1 for me. To me, it's most of life should be us creating sources of light that are then punctuated by that bitterness, by that darkness, that then in turn helps to grant meaning to the things that we've been doing this entire time. Because again, that is how the human brain operates. That's how we interpret things. It is projection. There are things in our life that should be sources of happiness. There are many things in all of our lives that are amazing. They're great. They should be something that is a great comfort to us, and we just don't notice them until they can be taken away from us. Like you might have two loving parents, and you've taken that for granted your entire life. Like you grew up being told, every day, I love you, and being hugged by your parents. And to you, that seems very, very normal. I didn't get that. Whenever I grew up, I was never told that I was, I love you. And I certainly never got any hugs from anyone, that's for sure. So that's something that a lot of people will take for granted. But for me, since I didn't have that, since that bitterness is in my life, that's something I project onto. So whenever someone actually does say, I love you, or gives me a hug or something, that has way more value. When someone even touches me on the shoulder, that kind of freaks me out sometimes, because I'm not used to someone like touching me. It just depends on what your life experience is and how you frame everything. Even in drawing, which I hope I'm finalizing here, the way line work works is it is a frame. It's a dark frame that helps to define the area around something. That's what a line is whenever you're drawing something. That's how come the human brain, the eye, can interpret information and register that as being an object. It's not a physical object because real-life objects are not defined by lines. They're light and shadow. But whenever it is harsh, and you're like drawing a circle, you can define that it's supposed to be a circle because of the fact that there is light being hit by something else, by darkness. And that's how the human eye and the brain registers things. It's comparative. It's layering things on top of each other and registering that things are distinct, different. And the best way to register that something gives you happiness is often to be able to see what doesn't give you happiness. The fact that there is the occasional line of darkness helps to define what the color happens to be around you. So that's how I see Lynch. That's how I interpret all of his work. And that's what I wanted to talk about, this idea that the way that he thinks, this transcendental meditation, diving deep into the unified field, is correlated to how I interpret things in the sense of everything mattering in terms of its projection and cultivating happiness and so on. And maybe more importantly, like I've made it clear, I don't think the same way that David Lynch does. Not many, almost no one does. But that's important. Because other people that are distinct from us, that think in very different ways that are still meaningful to us, are incredibly vital for the exact same reason. It is a meeting point of light and dark. It's bitter against sweetness. Like if you consider yourself to be so sweet, you're just so sweet, then people like David Lynch that are rubbing you the wrong way, for whatever reasons, by the way that they think or even the presentation of information or the stories that they tell, seeing those sorts of things helps you to define what it is that you like. Having people that are different, that are distinct, does help to enrich who you are. Now, as I say, maybe you shouldn't be immersing yourself in them because they are the framework. To me, the darkness should always be something that is out in the woods somewhere. It's the unknown. It should be something that is distanced from you, not something that you're swimming through constantly. But more importantly, whenever I think about Lynch, you can tell that my thoughts get very primal. And I think that's very important. Even though I don't agree with this unified field stuff, it is important to sometimes just think in terms of primal emotions. And that's what David Lynch does so well, is that because everything is very surreal, you sort of reach this state of either you end up overcomplicating things, like some people do, where they're just going back and evaluating every frame, just looking for secrets and clues and so on. Or you go backwards and you realize, no, I need to think about this in an artistic way. I need to think about it in terms of just what its raw information means to me on a primal level. And really, Bob in Twin Peaks, I'm not going to give away anything about Bob, but the Bob thing I was talking about Frank Silva just being behind a bed, looking up at Lynch, and that registering is something important to him. That turning into one of the most pivotal moments in all of Twin Peaks, and something that resonated for years after Frank Silva passed away. It became a vital piece of Twin Peaks lore because the character of Bob really embodies a lot of these concepts of just something is wrong in the world, and you don't know what it is. And that's often the point. That was sort of the whole point of Twin Peaks. A lot of people interpret it that way, that it's the death of television, or the ability for television to be rescued, the ability for writing to change people and to grant meaning to our lives and so on. Even the character of Laura Palmer, who killed Laura Palmer, this entire crux of Twin Peaks, the character of Laura Palmer herself is representative of that, the light and the darkness that is inside of one person. In many ways, Laura was supposed to be the character that was supposed to rescue television from itself. Because at the time in, the late 80s, early 90s, that's what David Lynch saw, is this move towards everything needs to be about violence and sadistic behavior, and there was no balance. There was no light in the stories that people were telling. And in Twin Peaks Season 3, he did the same thing. It opens the same way, of this is what television is like now. And that's what the tone of Twin Peaks Season 3 happened to be. And even in Twin Peaks Season 3, that message is still like, how do you rescue Laura? Like, how do you rescue the concept of this balance between light and darkness? It's one of those things that if you think that way, in that primal way, that diving deeper sort of way, as opposed to just looking for details, you do find more meaning as you keep going. And that is a lot of life. It's just the search for whatever it is that you're looking for. And that's very personalized. And that is what David Lynch is so good at. It evokes that. It helps you to be able to propel yourself to investigate. Lynch always talked a lot about happiness and how to achieve it. I'm not sure if he was happy in life. I have no idea. It's hard to tell with people sometimes, especially, entertainers. You don't know them. I hope that he was happy. And I hope that the things that he created brought you guys happiness. And I hope the things that I create have given you happiness as well. And I hope that you are cultivating your own happiness, and that this video helped to do a little bit of that as well. This was a little bit off the cuff, so I didn't really get a chance to script anything. Hope you understand. Hope you enjoyed the picture. It only took me 3 hours, so I kind of just sketched it together. I was looking at a photo on my other monitor, and just sort of doing a lot of guesswork, but it sort of looks like Lynch. It's okay. It's okay. Hope you enjoyed the video. I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.